Well, good evening, everyone. Can you hear me okay? And hopefully on our stream, you can hear me too. My name is Michael Lee, and along with my position as professor in the theology department in the Latin American and Latinx studies, I'm honored to serve as director of the Francis and Anne Curran Center for American Catholic Studies. It's my privilege and joy, really, to welcome you tonight to our first event with an in-person audience since the beginning of the pandemic. Here at the center, we do a number of things. We have a vibrant group of undergraduate students in Catholic studies, many of whom are here tonight. We sponsor critical research on Catholicism, including 2 book series at Fordham University Press and a New Scholar Essay Award. In fact, just 10 days ago, we had a wonderful lecture by this year's award winner, Kelly Schmidt, on reconstructing the experiences of enslaved people through Jesuit records. We sponsor a faculty reading seminar each semester, and just yesterday, we had a session on Eddie Glaude's wonderful recent book on James Baldwin. We do a number of public lectures and conferences, but I must say, tonight we hold one of the most special items on the Curran Center's slate of activity. Thanks to the generosity of Dr. Robert Jones, Professor Emeritus of History at Fordham, and the Jones family, the Curran Center holds the Rita Cassella Jones Lectures on women's issues in North American Catholic community. Rita was a loyal supporter of the center who faithfully attended whatever events she could. It's an amazing testimony to her legacy that we gather here for the 17th annual lecture. So, in honor of that, I'd like to acknowledge the members of the Jones family who were able to join us this evening. Tim and Maddie, Rob, Diane, and Sam, thank you so much for being with us tonight. And finally, I also want to thank my colleagues in this Curran Center, our administrator, Maria Terzulli, who coordinated the 1,000,001 details it takes to put this on, my colleagues on the center staff, Associate Directors Angela Alina O'Donnell, Michael Peppard, and John Seitz. In fact, I'm going to invite Dr. Seitz up here to introduce tonight's speaker. Thank you again for coming and for your ongoing support of the work of the Curran Center.
Welcome, everyone. Thanks, Michael. Wonderful to be here. And thank you for being here, everybody here in person, here on Zoom. We really appreciate it. As Michael said, my name is John Seitz. I am the Associate Director for the Curran Center at Lincoln Center. I also have a role in the theology department here at Fordham, where I teach courses on American religions. It's very exciting for me to have the opportunity today to introduce our speaker, Dr. Mary Corley Dunn, as this year's Rita Cassella Jones Lecturer. I first met Mary in graduate school, where I was stunned to learn that she was not only earning an advanced degree in the history of Christianity, but was also, at the same time, earning a J.D. at Harvard Law School. That was something. But then I learned that she was also a seamstress and ran her own dressmaking business. I knew I was witnessing something really special when it also turned out that Mary was not just brilliant and multi-talented, but also a kind and generous colleague, down to earth and void of pretense. It's been my pleasure and edification to be a witness to Mary's work over the years since then. Her scholarship, done from her position in the Department of Theological Studies at St. Louis University, focuses on early modern New France. She looks mainly at women religious, Jesuits, and Catholic theology in the part of the world we now call Canada. In addition to other works, she's the author of a book entitled The Cruelest of All Mothers, about a 17th century French woman who made the decision to leave her 11-year-old child to join religious life and become an Ursuline missionary in New France. The story, as you can imagine, is harrowing. Dunn takes the drama as an opportunity to explore ideas about sacrifice and motherhood in 17th century Catholicism, while also bringing those histories to bear on her own life as a mother, as well as on our contemporary ways of thinking about the idea of self-surrender as part of Catholic theology. Dunn's current research considers the changing ideas about infirmity and poverty in early modern France. Today, we will no doubt hear snippets from that work, as well as from her forthcoming book, finished and coming soon, entitled Where Paralytics Walk and the Blind See: Narratives of Sickness and Disability in New France. As you can tell from these brief descriptions, Dunn's work is highly attentive to stories of pain and struggle in the lives of women, and the ways theology intersects with them. Like few scholars I know, Dunn's stories, while profoundly rooted in careful historical research, never stay wholly in the past. I recently reread Emerson's Divinity School address from 1838, and in that famous speech, Emerson complained about the preachers of his day, talking about their hollow, dry, creaking sermons. He said that if they had ever lived and acted, we were none the wiser for it. Mary, to be sure, is no preacher, but in her work she heeds the advice of Emerson to, quote, deal out to the people life passed through the fires of thought. Dunn is a leader in our field because she has a humane and sophisticated ability to consider the intersections of her and our own lives with those of the people we're seeking to understand in the past. She teases out the consequences of those intersections, fearful, somber, or hopeful as they may be, for how we organize our lives today. Thus, we have the theme of her talk today: the juncture of worlds. Scholarship as a way of life, and living as a scholarly practice. Mary, Jones family, everyone here, thank you again for coming. It is a true pleasure to welcome you to Fordham. To the audience, please be aware that we will have a Q&A after the end of Mary's remarks. And I expect we will be done well in time for the Yankees game. And go Sox. Now I ask everyone, please, to join me in welcoming Dr. Dunn to the stage. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I think that was the nicest introduction I've ever heard, so thank you, John. Thank you to the Jones family, and thank you to the Kern Center for Catholic Studies here at Fordham for inviting me here tonight. Disability, writes Michael Berube, demands a story, so I'm going to begin with a story. One misty March morning, not so many years ago, I was running with my husband through Berlin's Tiergarten Park. In the company of scores of others, we followed the maze of tidy paths that opened into so many verdant lawns and secret gardens, so many tiny playgrounds and monuments to great dead men. We jogged past the Victory Column and the Bismarck Memorial, finally emerging on the side of Tiergartenstrasse, just opposite the Berlin Philharmonic. We crossed the street, and there, in the shadow of the Philharmonic's irregular angles and impossible proportions, stood a monument of a different sort. A long wall of blue glass sliced through the concrete plaza, cutting neatly like a surgeon's knife. Extending the length of the wall was a waist-high ledge that chronicled the progress of Hitler's T4 program, the Nazi euthanasia initiative that ended in the systematic annihilation of some 250,000 mentally and physically disabled people. I made my way slowly and silently down the ledge, my heart beginning to twist into knots and my throat tightening like a vise. As the raindrops rolled slowly down the text displays and over the photographed faces of victims, like Martin Bader and Ilse Lexas, I thought of my own daughter, Aggie, tightly curled in the hotel bed, between her brothers and sleeping under the watchful gaze of her grandmother. Aggie and her deep black eyes, Aggie and her soft little hands, Aggie and her precocious sense of humor, Aggie and her infectious charm, Aggie and her genetic difference that contemporary American medical culture registers as a disability. So this might seem like a strange place to begin a university lecture on a scholarly subject of general interest. But this is exactly where my new book, Where Paralytics Walk in the Blind Sea, out next spring, began. The book is a historical study of the meanings made of sickness and disability, which is what I call in the book embodied difference, in early modern French Canada. It's also at the same time an argument for and an enactment of a certain kind of historiography or history writing that I like to describe as proximate or attached or intimate or maybe just humane. So tonight I want to share with you both sides of this diptych, first fleshing out the approach to writing history I prescribe and perform in the book, and then turning to the nitty-gritty history of the Hôtel Dieu of Quebec and the ways in which the Augustinian nuns who staffed Canada's first hospital made sickness and disability meaningful through the medium of narrative. So we have this model of academic scholarship, whether we know it or not, of the absent-minded professor lost in usually his wonky mess of books and files and papers, socks mismatched, coffee stains on his lapel, so absorbed in the life of the mind that he forgets to eat, sometimes even to sleep. You know, in the world, but not of the world, which descriptive phrase applies equally well to the medieval Christian monk. That the university professor of our collective imagination comports himself much like his monastic brethren is no accident. Rather, it's a consequence of the university's origins in the monastic and cathedral schools of the medieval West, schools staffed by monks and nuns committed to preparing students for professional life in the church. Of course, we've come a long way from the earliest universities of Europe's High Middle Ages. Today's universities educate a much more diverse population of students in a much broader range of subject areas, using a much richer array of methodological approaches. But in many ways, advanced scholarship retains something of its original monastic flavor. In many ways, academics are still encouraged to be in the world, but not of the world, to keep a respectable distance from their subjects, to cultivate detachment, to practice disinterest. One could argue, in fact, that this triple mandate of distance, detachment, and disinterest has, if anything, intensified in the modern era. One could argue that, if anything, since the rise of Newtonian mechanics, empirical science, and the creep of secular naturalism, this has only made the standard of scholarly indifference more rigid, not less. The epistemological model undergirding advanced scholarship, even in the humanities, is one that promises we can know more and we can know better when we keep our subjects at arm's length. Too close and things get blurry, too attached, we can't think straight. So my new book, Where Paralytics Walk in the Blind Sea, was conceived as a response and an alternative to this reigning model of scholarly distance. It's a book that is both very much in the world and of the world. It aims, you might say, to bring the history of religion out of the cloister, to close the gap between scholar and subject, between past and present, in ways that do not hinder historical understanding, but enable it. For fundamental to the methodological commitments that subtend this book is a conviction that empathy affords historical understanding. It affords a richer, deeper kind of knowing about the past than distance, disinterest, and detachment permit. How else, after all, can the historian enter into the life world of the other than by bringing her own existential dilemmas and concerns into conversation with the past? How else can the historian really understand, not just intellectually, but cognitively, affectively, somatically, than by putting herself on the line? So let's return to Tiergartenstrasse. What did I see in that modest memorial to the victims of the T4 program? What was it exactly that gripped me in that most visceral of ways? Revulsion at the enormity of evils committed in the name of progress? Yes. But also the horror of recognition, the dread awareness that those same semantics that supported the genocide of 250,000 human beings between 1939 and 1945 continue to dominate the interpretation of embodied difference in the modern West. Variously, over the course of Western history, disabled bodies have been read as portents of civic disaster, punishment for the commission of sin, even proof of the diversity of God's creative genius. That was a good one. By the mid-19th century, however, for an assortment of reasons, disability had been made to signify overwhelmingly as a problem in need of a solution, a pathological mistake to be corrected with the interventions of medical science, a cancer on the human race to be cut out and eradicated forever. So what I saw in the memorial there on Tiergartenstrasse was the extreme expression of a certain kind of narrative pattern that figured disability as a problem to be solved. To be sure, the T4 program was a particularly monstrous variation on this theme. But the stories we tell about disability in the modern West, even after the Holocaust, still tend to follow the same predictable plotline. Shadowing cultural practices and technological interventions. Think rehabilitation, think surgery, think therapies. The stories we tell about disability in the modern West are overwhelmingly stories about overcoming, and only rarely stories about living, or even more rarely about thriving with disability. Lurking just below the surface of this familiar narrative pattern, shaping the meanings we make of disability, the range of possibilities for experiencing it, is a persistent eugenic impulse. So this is what I saw that morning on Tiergartenstrasse, although of course I would begin to realize it only later. And this is where my historical inquiry into the meanings made of embodied difference, both sickness and disability, in Catholic Canada under the French regime began. My interest in how the early modern French Catholics made embodied difference signify wasn't just professional, it was personal. To the dominant narrative that limbed disability as a problem in need of a solution, I wanted alternatives. I wanted to tell a different kind of story about disability, a story that was not at its core about fixing what had gone wrong. For various reasons as the project matured, reasons that were just as proximate and intimate as those that drove me to ask about disability, I found I wanted to tell a different story about sickness, too. A story that exceeded the limits of what Arthur Frank calls the restitution narrative, that familiar way of figuring sickness as a mechanical problem with the body that calls for medical attention and that resolves in the event of the cure. I think we're all familiar with this story. Sometimes, of course, the restitution narrative, whether applied to sickness or disability, fits. At some moments and in some contexts, sickness and disability really are problems in need of solution and little else. But when restitution is impossible, when disability is chronic, when sickness is terminal, when recovery is imperfect and impermanent, which it usually is, what options are there for telling the stories of sickness and disability otherwise? How else might we narrate our inevitable encounters with embodied difference, other than as a problem in need of a solution? How else might we imagine what it means to be sick? How else might we fathom the experience of disability? Just how far, and in which directions, might we stretch the range of available grammars for rendering embodied difference legible? These are the questions that are at the heart of Where Paralytics Walk in the Blind Sea. With this project, I have sought to expand the interpretive possibilities for making sense of sickness and disability. At the foundation of my historical analysis are 4 primary sources, all of which come from this distinct historical context of early modern French Catholic Canada, and each of which is a little bit different from the other in terms of audience, authorship, and genre. But I bring the same set of questions to each of these diverse yet coherent sources. How are the stories of sickness and disability told? Who are the subjects? Who are the objects? What does embodied difference signify? And how? What narrative strategies, which relations of power, which discursive forms enable some meanings and foreclose others? So I want to turn now to the fruits of some of this research, focusing in particular on the second of my primary sources, the Histoire de l'Hôtel Dieu de Québec, and the ways in which the Augustinian sisters who staffed Canada's first hospital made sickness and disability meaningful in the context of their religious vocation. Writing from Quebec in the summer of 1635, Jesuit father Paul Lejeune told the tale of, quote, a good savage woman named Uitata Samakayu. Uitata had been found by the Jesuits near their settlement, very sick and lying upon the hard ground. Wishing neither to see the woman, quote, die before our eyes a victim to the cold, nor to shelter her in the fort where, another quote, there were only men, Lejeune and his confrère, Jacques Boutou, finally resorted to force, compelling her kinspeople to, quote, return from the woods and put up a little cabin for her, where every day we carried her food and instructed her. Uitata survived long enough for the Jesuits to expound to her the articles of their belief and baptize her in the chapel. What Lejeune hoped to impress upon his readers, however, was not so much the fortunate outcome of this particular case, but the untapped potential of sickness in general as an accessory to the missionary project. If this single success story could be replicated on a larger scale, this, quote, miserable hut where Uitata drew her final breath institutionalized in the form of a well-staffed hospital, the payoff for the mission could be tremendous. Imagine, Lejeune exclaimed, how great is the necessity for a hospital here and how much fruit it could produce. Alone, the Jesuits could only do so much. But with the aid of women religious trained in the latest techniques of palliative care and ameliorative care, the mission might make substantial gains. And not only among those like Uitata who might be persuaded to convert before dying or before being healed, but also with their children, who the Jesuits reasoned would, quote, belong to the nursing sisters after their parents died. Within a few years, the first 3 Hospitaller nuns had arrived in New France and set up shop at Sillery, which was a mission community founded by Jesuits along the banks of the St. Lawrence River. Those who came first to the hospital, such as it was, were victims of smallpox. The nuns were overwhelmed. Our occupations, Sister St. Bonaventure wrote, grew daily, until done in by relentless fatigue, all 3 sisters fell ill. In just 6 short months, the Hospitaller nuns had exhausted a supply of provisions intended to last for 2 years, and they were forced to borrow until the ships returned. But it hadn't been for naught, for, quote, among so much labor and misery, we had the consolation that among those we assisted, none died without baptism. It was a promising beginning to institutional health care in the French colony, and exactly what the Jesuits had hoped for. An account of this hospital's early history is given in the primary source I want to talk about tonight, this Histoire de l'Hôtel Dieu de Québec. It was published in France in 1751. The Histoire tracks the evolution of the Hôtel Dieu from its foundation in 1636 through periods of wars, epidemics, growth, expansion, to 1716, when the narrative finally comes to a close. The Histoire is a really big book. It's 425 pages of published text, and yet it's light, unexpectedly light, on details about the sick, whose care constituted what the Hospitaller nuns called the spirit of their vocation. Landmark events in French-Canadian history figure in the Histoire, alongside reports of triennial elections, sporadic epidemics, new postulants, building projects, and other matters of community concern. But stories about the sick, who suffered and died and sometimes recovered under the watchful eyes of the Hospitaller nuns, are in surprisingly short supply. But why? Why would a written history of an institution vowed to, quote, helping the neighbor in his poverty and in his sicknesses, include so few stories about those neighbors, their poverty, and their sicknesses, about the quotidian experiences of caregiving, healing, and hospital work, about the patients who came and went in one way or another through those venerable gates? It's a matter, I think, of audience. The Histoire was an insider text. It was intended only for circulation within this Hospitaller community. It was a didactic text intended to teach nursing sisters of Canada's first hospital who they were, why caregiving mattered, and what illness, their own and others, meant. Patient stories are few and far between in the histoire, albeit purposeful and deliberate. But stories of moribund nuns who wore themselves out in the service of the sick abound. Sickness and disability are made meaningful in this Histoire de l'Hôtel-Dieu de Quebec as indices of hospitaller identity. Harnessed to didactic ends, the stories of sickness and disability recounted in the Histoire, both those about the patients who came from the outside and those about the nuns who labored in the inside, figure the nursing sisters of Quebec's first hospital as missionaries whose vocation it was to save the souls of others and to sanctify themselves. The first of the Hospitaller nuns in Quebec had been recruited for service to the colony from the Hôtel-Dieu in Dieppe, in France, an institution that in one way or another had ministered to the poor sick since the early Middle Ages. The Hospitaller nuns attached to the Hôtel-Dieu were part of a broader network of women, both lay and religious, committed to the active apostolate of nursing in the wake of the Catholic Reformation. Although hospitals had long been part of the landscape of Catholic Europe, the early modern period saw significant reforms to these medieval foundations, transforming them from local houses of hospitality dedicated to spiritual succor to established institutions committed to the care of both body and soul. To the traditional focus on saving the souls of the poor sick, early modern hospitals added a focus on treating their bodies, supplementing the traditional theology that emphasized patients as figures of Christ with a theology that recognized caregivers as species of Christus Medicus, or Christ the physician. Working in persona Christi, or in the person of Christ, the Hospitaller nuns of Quebec's Hôtel-Dieu devoted a substantial proportion of their daily energies for caring for the bodies of the sick. They visited their patients 4 times a day, in the morning, at lunch, for afternoon instruction, and at dinner. They kept the rooms clean, they swept the floors, they emptied the trash. They provided basic medical care to the patients, following doctor's orders, and giving the sick whatever medications had been prescribed. But for the nuns of the Hôtel-Dieu, these corporeal ministrations were not ends in themselves. Rather, they were ancillary to the chief objective of spiritual salvation that constituted for the Hôtel-Dieu its ultimate raison d'etre. Caring for the body at the Hôtel-Dieu was a means of rehabilitating the soul. And for patients, it would not have been lost on them that their physical recovery, though important, was subordinated to their spiritual regeneration within the 4 walls of this hospital. The relentless feeding, washing, dressing, and treatment of the sick took place in an institutional context that was, from its architectural structure to its daily rhythm, profoundly religious. Within 24 hours of entering the Hôtel-Dieu, new patients were required to make a confession and receive communion. They were then assigned to beds in the Salle de Malade, at the foot of which beds were plaques bearing the names of saints or other holy figures by which the nuns could identify these patients. I'd like to think of this as an analog to today's digital armband. On the walls of the Salle de Malade hung a number of paintings with distinctly religious themes, including 3 paintings depicting various stages of Christ's crucifixion, the collective effect of which would have reminded patients as their privileged status as proxies for Christ. Elsewhere in the Hôtel-Dieu, and alongside portraits of the institution's secular and religious patrons, hung 2 evocative paintings, one featuring a bloody, mutilated Christ, the other an Augustinian nun tending to Christ in the person of the sick. Both of these paintings would surely have impressed upon the poor sick and the nuns alike the Christological implications of their respective roles. And if all this was not enough to persuade patients that the nuns cared at least as much for their souls as they did for their bodies, the daily 15-minute religious lesson, which the nuns were warned never to neglect, would have removed all doubt. When patients recovered and left the Hôtel-Dieu, which most of them did, they returned to the world not just physically whole, but also, and especially, spiritually fortified, with new habits of prayer, penitence, and moral scrupulosity. From the beginning, the Hospitaller nuns of Quebec's Hôtel-Dieu imagined themselves, and were imagined by others, as the cloistered female counterparts to the Jesuits at work in Canada's eastern woodlands. By the terms of the hospital's foundation, the nursing sisters had been commissioned to, quote, aid in the salvation of the poor savages, charged with missionary responsibilities of no less consequence to the evangelization of the New World than those of the Jesuits. And this, despite the rule of enclaustration, or the cloister, imposed by the Council of Trent. In language that blurred the lines between Jesuits on the frontier and nuns in the cloister, the Histoire praises those first of the colonial Hospitaller nuns, like this. Quote, "These remarkable women left their parents, friends, acquaintances, and the comforts of a beautiful country to come to the end of the world, across the sea, exposing themselves to losing everything in the harshest of climates, in order to contribute to the salvation of souls. The indigenous people's reputation for cannibalism and barbarism notwithstanding," and I'm still quoting here, "these fervent religious women concerned themselves only with the desire to sacrifice themselves for God, yearning to do what they must, to acquire souls for our Lord, and persuading themselves that they couldn't satisfy their zeal unless they followed the barbarians into the woods like the missionaries do." Close quote. The language of exposure here is hardly accidental, but it's funny when you think of cloistered nuns. They're the opposite of exposed, but this is not the imagination in which the nuns are living their vocation. Far from their families, their friends, their patrons, bereft of the familiar comforts of home, Hospitaller nuns stretched the confines of the cloister to the max. No barrier to a missionary vocation, the cloister wall of the Hôtel Dieu merely reversed the flow of traffic. It wasn't the nuns who went out, but patients who went in. Theirs was a charitable charge, to be sure, but charity specifically conceived as missionary strategy. Spending themselves out in the service of the sick, the nursing sisters hoped to win their patients to Christianity, or at least to give them a good impression of such a useful and generous religion, as they put it, to lead them little by little to embrace it. And although the cloistered nuns couldn't always see the fruits of their labors, the Jesuits did. Those who recover their health, affirmed Paul de Jeune, go back to their cabins without often letting the nuns know the good which this charity has wrought in their souls. And this is still Lejeune. The savages, having received therein help in their sicknesses, have been firmly won to God. So hospital charity as missionary strategy. Discharged from the Hôtel Dieu, patients return to the world, agents of a reformed Catholicism, capable of spreading piety and sobriety among those who needed it most. Given the nature of the Hôtel Dieu as an institution adjunct to the broader missionary enterprise in early modern New France, it's not surprising that those few stories we actually do find about patients in the Histoire hew in broad outline to the pattern of illness narratives you find in the Jesuit Relations, which are, for those of you who don't know, these 17th century annual reports that are fun to read and that are sent from the Jesuits every year back from New France to their patrons and superiors in France. In these stories, embodied difference, whether it's sickness or disability, is figured as an opportunity for conversion and an occasion for the cultivation of virtue. This is especially true in the Histoire of stories about Indigenous Americans who constituted the bulk of the hospital's patients before 1644. Sometimes convalescence at the Hôtel Dieu provoked Indigenous patients to seek baptism in the Catholic Church. Other times, particularly in those cases where the patient had already been baptized at the time of their admission, illness provoked the exercise of the virtues of patience, constancy, and holy resignation. So here's an example. There's a story of the final moments of a great chief of the Maliseets. This story vividly illustrates the mechanics of missionary work undertaken behind the cloister wall. Having traveled far from home in order to seek out the sacraments, this chief had fallen dangerously ill, and he took refuge at the Hôtel Dieu. The attending sisters were, quote, witnesses to his holy dispositions. Foreseeing death approach, he called one of his sons and spoke with him so affectingly that those present were moved to tears. In a virtuous display of constancy, even at the end of life, the chief testified to his high esteem for Christianity and to, as he put it, the joy he felt for having embraced prayer and never having abandoned it. He begged his son to cling to the faith and to urge his wife to do the same, for, quote, they would find it good and God would take care of them. With the hospital's move in 1644 to the safety of Quebec at the height of the Beaver Wars, the patient population at the Hôtel Dieu started to shift. Hospitaller nuns continued to treat the indigenous sick, but their attentions were focused increasingly on a mostly European clientele. These demographic transformations in the patient population are reflected in illness narratives, which also shift over the course of the Histoire to focus on protagonists of European descent. What's striking, though, is that not a single one of these illness narratives features a patient of French Catholic heritage, even though we know that the vast majority of patients who came in and went out of the Hôtel Dieu were both French and Catholic. Instead, patient narratives after 1644 feature a motley assortment of French Huguenots, French Protestants, British Protestants, and even Jansenists. But why? Stories like these, I suspect, figure in the Histoire not because they were average stories, but because they were powerful stories, stories that reinforce to a hospitaller readership the missionary dimensions of its nursing vocation. These were stories that packed a didactic punch, stories that drew the boundaries of hospitaller identity in ways that reinscribed the nursing sisters as vectors of a post-Tridentine Catholicism in the New World, and safeguards of French Catholic hegemony in the colony. In these stories, illness is figured as a medium of conversion in keeping with the model of the Jesuit relations, but conversion described specifically as spiritual reform and abjuration of heresy. The efficacy of hospitaller charity in persuading religious others to return to the Catholic Church is illustrated by the best story in the whole Histoire. This is the story of, as the Histoire puts it, one of the most obstinate heretics we have ever seen. The man, a Huguenot, had been urged to convert to Catholicism many times before, but he had refused, repeatedly, swearing that he would never reject the religion he professed. As luck would have it, though, the man fell dangerously ill and was brought to the Hôtel Dieu. The nuns, moved by his condition, prayed fervently, but to no avail. The man continued to worsen. Finally, one nun, Catherine of St. Augustine, who ends up becoming the most kind of celebrated of all these hospitaller nuns, thought to slip into the man's drink a pinch of the pulverized bones of Jean de Brébeuf, recently martyred Jesuit. Immediately, the Histoire reports, this intransigent man became as sweet as a lamb, begged to be instructed, embraced the Catholic faith with joy, and made a public abjuration of his Huguenot heresy, with such admirable fervor that he astonished himself with his transformation. He left the hospital fully recovered, God, the nuns put it, wanting to give him the health of the body, as well as that of the soul. Patient narratives like these are crucial to the didactic aims of the Histoire. Reinforcing for a hospitaller readership, remember this was a book written by nuns for nuns, reinforcing for this readership the missionary dimensions of Christian charity. Stories like these elucidate the ways in which illness offered opportunities for conversion, and caregiving the occasion for the salvation of souls. But these stories about patients, as I said in the beginning of the presentation, are few and far between in the Histoire. Overwhelmingly, the stories we read of sickness and disability in this text are stories about the nursing sisters themselves, about their sicknesses, their disabilities, their suffering and pain and deaths. No less crucial to the articulation of hospitaller identity, these other narratives, these stories about the morbidity and mortality of Augustinian nuns, make embodied difference meaningful as the byproduct of charitable labor and the medium of personal salvation. Alike imagined as alteri Christi, other Christs, alike tested and tried by the experience of illness, the poor sick and the nursing sisters who tended them shared mutually in a single economy of salvation. The practice of Christian charity as it worked itself out in the Hôtel Dieu was doubly redemptive, redounding at once to the spiritual rehabilitation of the hospital's patients and at the same time to the sanctification of the nursing sisters. Caring for the sick in the context of an early modern hospital was a vital exercise, this is what the nuns' constitutions say, a vital exercise for those bent on mastering themselves and struggling for the souls of the sick and the dying. It was also a means of asceticism, a technique, as they put it, for mortifying the senses. But importantly, what I want to stress here is that over the long haul, these penances and mortifications incurred in the service of the sick presented opportunities for the kind of self-denial that made martyrs of men in the Jesuit mission field. The Histoire abounds with illness narratives that interpret the final moments of nuns who spent themselves out in the Hôtel Dieu as ultimate gifts of self, out of love of the faith. This text attributes the death of Mother St. Ignace, for instance, to the great fatigues she suffered during the winter of 1646, tending to Wendat refugees on the run from their Haudenosaunee foes. Years later, what was called the malady of Siam would reduce 24 nuns to extremis. Of these, 6 would ultimately die, exhausted by, as the Histoire puts it, excessive fatigues and the necessity of keeping vigil twice weekly through the winter months. Now, of course, stories like these reflect the historical fact that nursing sisters must often have disabled themselves in service to the sick, must often have contracted illnesses brought to the Hôtel Dieu by their patients. But my argument is that the way these stories are told in the Histoire, with a marked emphasis on the connection between charitable service and personal suffering, even unto death, suggests a martyrological dimension that figures the nuns as missionaries of no less consequence to the Christianization of French Canada than their Jesuit brothers. Even those narratives that fall short of martyrological standards make illness meaningful as the theater within which virtues acquired in the service of the sick were exercised to edifying ends. In the deathbed scenes that dramatize the nursing sisters' last hours, illness sets the stage not for the first soundings of Christian virtue, as they do in the patient narratives above, but for the final perfection of virtue, offering to the living a template for how to die well and an object lesson in the fruits of hospitaller charity. Those familiar virtues of patience, constancy, and holy resignation that we saw in the patient narratives are on full display in these final moments of nursing sisters like Marie Renée de la Nativité, who, paralyzed, unable to speak, and afflicted with a painful edema, nonetheless, quote, never showed the least sign of impatience or chagrin, but rather made it understood that she felt an inexplicable joy for having left everything for God. Death, as it is rendered in these scenes that so often follow from illness narratives of the Hospitaller nuns, was not a private event, but a very public one. No death described in the Histoire was more spectacular than Catherine of St. Augustine's, that nun who dipped Jean de Brébeuf's bones in the Huguenot's drink. Gathered around her bed, Catherine's confessor, superior, fellow nursing sisters, and the little pensioners, which were these little girls who were educated by the Hospitaller nuns. So surrounded by all of these people who wanted to witness her death, Catherine was watched attentively. All those gathered around her were hoping to profit from her last moments, and they observed Catherine as she slipped out of consciousness and back again until she finally drew her last breath, her cheeks paradoxically rosy with the appearance of full health, which, quote, gave us pleasure to see. So these illnesses and these deaths were moments of edification. Hospitaller illnesses that ended in accounts of exemplary deaths like these were intended to teach. Stories like these presented to the Hospitaller community a vivid illustration of what it was not just to live well as a nursing sister, but to die well too. Read alongside the patient narratives of Indigenous converts and recovered Protestants, Hospitaller illness narratives come into focus as stories of conversion too. but conversion rendered as a gradual turning towards sanctification. These are not stories of sudden change, as in the case of the Huguenot converted by the bones of Jean de Brebeuf. These are stories instead of the slow burn of holiness, fueled by the painstaking, tireless labor of piety, regularity, and charity in the service of the sick. I'd call them stories of the same genus, if not the same species, as the patient illness narratives. These hospitaller illness narratives follow this predictable plotline that leads from physical affliction to spiritual salvation. In these stories, however, the semantics of illness is doubled. At once the crucible within which nursing sisters forged over years of relentless service virtues of hagiographic proportions, and at the same time, the final stage upon which dying nuns exercised those virtues to edifying perfection, embodied difference was made to signify in the histoire in ways that left no room to doubt why caregiving mattered and the good it could do for the soul. So, where does this leave us? What difference does this make? What difference could it make? What difference should it make? To know how the nursing sisters of Quebec's Hôtel Dieu made sickness and disability meaningful through the stories they told. To know that they figured embodied difference, both sickness and disability, as opportunities for conversion, as occasions for the cultivation of virtue, as media of sanctification. Well, it depends on where you stand. From behind the cloistered wall of the academy, conditioned by this triple mandate of distance, detachment, and disinterest, not much. But outside the cloister wall, from a position of proximity, attachment, and interest, the answer is otherwise. Here, at the juncture of worlds, at the intersection of scholarship and the rest of life, historiography pursued as a practice of empathetic encounter does make a difference. And not only to what we can know about the past, for surely empathy opens up avenues of understanding that apathy forecloses, but it also makes a difference to what we can know about our present and to the breadths of our visions for the future. Scholarship, writes anthropologist Saba Mahmoud, is most powerful when it leaves open the possibility that we might also be remade in the process of engaging another worldview, that we might come to learn things we didn't already know before we undertook the engagement. Historiography undertaken from a posture of proximity and passionate attachment is attuned precisely to such possibilities of transformation. So what then is the existential and epistemological yield of the history I've written in my book, Where Paralytics Walk and the Blind See, of the history I've shared with you this evening? What do we get when we pursue scholarship at the juncture of worlds, when we close the gap between past and present, between scholar and subject, in ways that blur these boundaries between academic research and the rest of life? In this case, at a minimum, we get relief from the suffocating hegemony of the restitution narrative, from that heavy-handed plot line that figures both sickness and disability as problems in need of solution alone. The stories told by my early modern primary sources, stories of miracles and virtue, conversion and redemption, suffering and sanctity, are powerful reminders that all narrative representations of embodied difference, even ours, are historically contingent and culturally conditioned. My argument is not that there's a better way to tell stories of sickness and disability. I certainly don't want to bring back the idea that infirmity is caused by sin, or that pain is a form of penitence. My argument, rather, is that there's something life-giving about recognizing the infinite malleability of narrative. At a minimum, historiography, pursued as this disciplined practice of encounter, reminds us that meaning, whether it's the meaning of sickness, the meaning of disability, or the meaning even of history, the histories we write, is never made, but is always in the making. The kinds of stories told by early modern Catholics, like the Augustinian nuns of Quebec's Hôtel Dieu, invite us, or should, to imagine sickness and disability otherwise, not maybe in the ways that the nuns imagined it, but in ways that are more expansive than simply the problem to be solved. The kinds of stories we find in dusty, musty texts like the Histoire recall us, or should, to the freedom to play creatively with the meanings we make of embodied difference. Recovering the stories told about sickness and disability in the early modern Catholic past and bringing them into conversation with the stories we tell today has the effect of unsettling the signifying power of both. And, most importantly, of transforming not only how we interpret our ailing and infirm bodies, but how we experience them too. In the end, if there's anything worth taking from the early modern Catholic past and applying to our modern present, it is this: that embodied difference is not only or always a problem in need of a solution, that we need not wait for a cure or a treatment to go on living, that we can find meaningful ways of flourishing and even thriving, not in spite of, but with sickness and disability. And this, I think, is enough. Thank you.
We have time for questions, so you can run around with the microphone and just stand up and tell us who you are and then ask a question.
Hi, thank you so much. My name is Michael. I'm a professor at Yale, working here at the Conference Center staff as well. And my question goes back to the New Testament. So as a class I teach a lot, and I kept thinking throughout your talk about the sequence of healing to conversion that happens throughout the life of Jesus and his ministry, but also his followers, right? Like
Yeah.
the Apostles of Acts, where they gain the attention of people through a miraculous event, and upon which follows, deeper instruction and teaching. And this continues throughout Christianity. It's largest growth period. So I know this is a problem throughout the history of the studies of the missionary movements of Christianity, but I feel like I just wonder if we reflect. I'm sure you have reflected on it, how much this goes back to the core, and for these sisters who are hearing scripture every day, and praying every day. I guess I'm just wondering how difficult might it be to think outside of that paradigm of Jesus as a healer and the apostles as healers that they were depicting.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Through the repetition of all those same stories. Just curious if that comes up in the text that you work with, or.
Yeah. Well, I think, that's a great question. I hear two things in it. One, I think of, they were saturated in scripture, and they were also surrounded by, not only were they hearing scripture and reciting scripture, but they also were surrounded by all those holy paintings of, like, exactly that, of those themes. And I do think they certainly saw themselves as imitating Christ, as acting that out. And, I think my own sense, I'm an early modernist, not a medievalist or a scholar of ancient Christianity, but my understanding is those earliest of the Christian hospitals go back to, precisely that legacy, this idea that charity is a way of imitating the ministrations of Christ. One of the things I think is troubling, though, in the New Testament stories, and I think it is especially so for scholars of disability studies, is what do you do with those stories that align so closely salvation and the removal of disability? Like, is there a way to argue your way out of that, so that you can read the New Testament in a way that's not an ableist? I don't know. I think people have done some creative things with that. But in another chapter of my book, I deal with a set of 22 miracles that remind me very much of the New Testament miracles, in that in these cases, problems with the body are solved, and this is miraculous, and of course, this is a good thing. And how do we read those stories through a lens that does not seem to be reinforcing this narrative that I'm trying to work against, this narrative of the problem to be solved? God comes down and God solves the problem. The saint comes down, the saint solves the problem. I think that's really tricky, but I think it's certainly a legacy here. But I hear in the stories they tell about both sickness and disability, that's certainly a theme, and yet there's this other trajectory that these events are meaningful. And like there are ways of, in their world, there were certainly ways of flourishing as a Christian in those contexts. So, thank you.
Other questions?
Thank you very much, all of you did it from graduate perspective. And the story that comes to me as a Vietnam, when it was story, and it might be a missionary came, I guess it's from Vietnam, which is for the power. And also I studied some historical education and how the American school come from cathedral school and Protestant school. And but this is like now that we pass and forget. So how can we keep that memory? Because we really spend all that children on Catholic school or religious school. So how can we keep the image alive in our academic world?
Yeah, can you, so how can we keep the image? Can you just rephrase?
Like religious connection, religious story, religious, like the missionary, for example, they go to Vietnam.
Yeah.
With the word of God, and we should keep that alive in our country for the last 400 years. And in terms of education, how we can keep the image of the sister or the priest, the missionary, how we can keep them alive for the generation like this for a time.
Yeah. So is the question sort of like how do we keep in a world in which we don't see missionaries and nuns operating in the way they did historically, how do we keep this alive? Well, yeah, I'm not sure I could answer that question, but I recently returned from a new research trip to Quebec last month. And in some ways there, which is the world I study, it's very much alive, but in a strange kind of like a secular way. This Hotel Dieu that I lectured on tonight is still in operation, and it was run by the nuns. This is actually really interesting. It was run by the nuns until the 1960s when Canada had its quiet revolution and most religious institutions moved secular. But this Hotel Dieu, which is still an operating hospital and still has a convent attached, has also been converted in a little section into a spa, which is really interesting. But it's a wellness center where people can come and spend the night and do various treatments, but with like the ethos of the Augustinian nuns still operating. So for instance, at breakfast, you're encouraged to maintain silence, to imitate the practice of these Augustinian nuns. And so it was interesting for me to be there and to walk around this hospital and this monastery and this spa and see the way in which, at least for these nuns, I think they're making some money off of this, but they're also transmitting their heritage and their legacy in this more secular language. I'm not sure if it's good enough or if it's, good enough for some, not good enough for others, but it was interesting to see how some of this heritage gets transposed in a more secular idiom. Thanks.
Other questions?
As you're speaking about disability, and as I was wondering about mental disability, and I guess I was thinking particularly of something like dementia or something where someone wouldn't be able to personally participate in this sort of recognition of the connections with Jesus that come from suffering. And so, I don't know if in your studies, any of that you ever encountered that, or how much does one have to be able to recognize, what's going on in the team, in order to experience the stabilization? Thank you.
That's a wonderful question. I'll say a couple of things about it. First, I think perhaps most importantly, one of the main takeaways, I think, from this research for me with these nuns and the way they cared for patients was that the care they gave was not just about the patients. It was about what they were receiving through the act of caregiving. And I think that's where that image of Jesus being both, like the nuns standing in persona Christi, as like Christus Medicus, and the patients being proxy for Christ, like how that works together. So surely the patients, those patients who had a kind of mental disability, whether dementia or another kind, wouldn't have perhaps understood in ways they could have articulated at the very least what this care was about, but the nuns did. And it's interesting, it's like a way of, I think we've really lost a lot of that, but it's a way of relating it's a way of relating to the patient that I think has disappeared in some ways. There's a beautiful book, Arthur Kleinman wrote a recent book called The Soul of Care. I think it was published in 2019, but it is about his care of his wife, who's really, suffering from kind of acute dementia at this point. But I think about this book when I was researching this chapter and write about it a bit at the end of this particular chapter in the book, because I think this is exactly what the nuns were doing. They were learning something, and they were, in their own words, they may have said something like they were receiving grace through the act of caregiving, which makes that caregiving meaningful, if not for the patient, then for the caregiver. Which, again, I think we've kind of lost a little bit of that today, but that seems to me something worth reminding ourselves of, that caregiving is not just for the patient, but it's also for the caregiver. Thank you.
I might ask okay. You end with the word enough, and what you're saying there is practice that the imagination and the openness of narrative that history and empathetic mode provides is enough. And we don't stick to the vision narrative that we have right now. I want to ask you your text. I know you've kind of pushed back on the temptations to say that approach of the religious that you write about is attractive, right?
Right.
You don't want it to be replaced. You don't want it to replace our system in any clean or obvious way. I just want to ask you if you were like to explore that temptation, that sense, to make that type of approach, their approach, into something that is better, right? Yeah. It is more applicable, or it is more effective, or more appropriate to making sense of disability and illness now. So I guess want to push you on the enough.
Yeah.
And explore any temptations that you have. I feel like they might be there in some ways, but to push you a little bit on some of those questions about what could we learn from those ways.
Yeah, that is the temptation, right? Originally when I had conceived this book, I wanted to say everything I said, and then I wanted to do like some last chapter. Well, what if we just went a little bit further? What would that look like? I mean, I think that, I do think that this sense of just, at least in the case of these nuns, the sense of just being with, the sense of being able to relate to and being with the patient in the case of this hospital seems to me something worth borrowing or worth kind of bringing back to life, rehabilitating, resurrecting. And also this sense that I suppose like this is really what I was getting at, and I suppose you could say it's this sense that we're not locked into the story we've been fed about what a sick or disabled body means. Like that in itself is liberating. But I also think if there's a little bit more, if there would be one thing I would really want to take, I think it would be this sense that there is, and perhaps not in the way that the nuns thought about this. Perhaps this doesn't work for everybody, but there's a sense in which it's possible to thrive and flourish in the midst of those kinds of experiences. I mean, and it seems to me, I say this in the book, but it seems to me that this is urgent for all of us because it's coming, you know? And so it may be short or it may be long, but you know, none of us are going to escape encounters like this with our failing bodies. And so, you know, finding a way to live that in a way that's conducive to life seems to me to be urgent. And I think the nuns did that really well. So maybe it would be that.
I think women really have been doing some news lately about the models for aging.
Oh, how about that?
Thank you so much for your beautiful talk. I'm at the Center, and this conversation that you're just having with my colleague John just reminds me of my mother died 11 years ago, and I was taking care of her in the last days, and she was very much disabled. And I wrote a memoir about this, and as I was thinking about the powerful experience of caring for people who are disabled, especially close to you. Everything that you did for her, first of all the many beautiful stories that I heard all of my life suddenly became very real to me. So the women who go to the soup in the morning with the spices and the more and I felt like, okay, we're these women. We have our spices and our instead we bring other sacramentals to the table, and we're going to these sort of ritual actions that are helping her out of this life in a way that is dignified and beautiful. And the priest was communicating her music, but I felt as though what we were doing was very similar, was analogous to what the priest was doing. It was a kind of sacramental experience. So the book basically is a sacrament of beauty. This is what there's a number of different chapters that talk about these various ways in which simple actions that are performed so that they start the same person, even though they're almost the sacraments. And I use that regularly. They're not sacraments in the church, they're second mindset. And so I'm curious about whether or not, and also that we did feel very, very Jesus-like, very priest-like, very Jesus-like doing these things. And again, there are women doing that before. And I'm just curious, do you think there was any sense of that from these religions who are performing this sacramental rituals for the people that are there?
Yeah, oh, that's such a great question. First of all, I'd love to read your memoir. That sounds beautiful. That's interesting. I do think, you know, I was struck by just almost how obvious their self-rendering as missionaries was. So, you know, this gender bending bit, and so I wouldn't be surprised if that's how they thought of it. And even, you know, I didn't go into this detail, but there was such a ritual to their mornings and to their meals with the patients that was almost liturgical. So I think that makes a lot of sense that they would have imagined their activities of caregiving as sacramental in a way. And I haven't heard that spoken of, but I think that's probably a really accurate way of describing it.
Are there any additional questions? Yes, one last question.
Hi, my name is Emily Rita. I'm an undergraduate student in the Catholic Center. It's part of my concentration. I just have a question. So I really like your approach and your analysis of experience, and it really kind of seems to contradict the concept of like others that's attached to missionary work. I think of being like we are the Catholics, we are living in, we are helping you convert to what you should be. In some of the quotations you had, it was talked about the concept of using people as savages and just in general also people who are not Catholic. So I was just wondering, how can you, or if you talk about it, look at all, reconcile this not inclusive aspect to missionary work that is part of the foundation of these nuns, given it is very inclusive?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, one of the things I think about Catholicism and the way it works or it spreads, or like the way missionary kind of history really works is that it's out of control. It's spiraled kind of, it's beyond people. Things happen when it enters into new areas and new geographies and encounters new people. And so, you know, perhaps as exclusive as the Jesuits were, Christianity itself, as it spread, was inclusive beyond their intentions, which I think is interesting. And maybe the question is, how do we tell the history of Christianity in a way that doesn't focus over much on missionary orders like the Jesuits or missionary orders like these Hospitaller nuns, which deserve attention because they're part of the story. But what else was going on? Like, what other kinds of histories can we bring into conversation with those histories that are just easier to tell because the sources are there? So how do we, I think this is, I really like this question. I mean, to me, it's a question of methodology. How do we resuscitate some of those harder to find stories? And you have to get really creative, I think. I recently read a wonderful book by Corinne Velez called The Miraculous Flying House of Loretto. And the book was about early modern Catholicism and Catholicism becoming global and the way this particular devotion spread across the world. But one of her methodological approaches, which I found so interesting, the big question in the book is kind of like, how did ideas of the Virgin Mary shift and change as Catholicism spread? And she asks, well, what difference did all of these Wendat women, so these indigenous women in northeastern Canada, who were named Mary after they converted to Catholicism, what difference did all of these Marys, like living, make to people's imaginations of who the Virgin Mary was? Which is a really cool, creative approach. I'm not sure exactly how far you can take it, but to even think to ask a question like that seems maybe the best way to counter this hegemonic, you know, religious order narrative that we tend to stick with simply because it's easy. It's a good question.
All right, so thank you for the great questions, everybody. Please join me in thanking Dr. Courtney Dunn for her presentation.
Thank you. So much. Thank you for listening.
I'll let you, I'm sure. I won't sequester you. It's like a couple blocks away. Yeah. So it shouldn't be that way. You know, in our book generation. Oh, her new book? Yes. I just bought it. Oh my gosh, yeah. I just read it like yesterday and today. Yes. How is it? It's that is about the house. Like, it's similar. If you're gonna, I'll be curious what you think. It's much more comes down hard on the colonial. Hospital caretaking, yeah, but then she does try to kind of bring like the indigenous Catholicism. I'll be very curious. Tell me when you finish it. Yeah. But it's good. I think it's really good, but it's much more comes down really hard on the friars who do caretaking. So yes. You know what? I can't really read it carefully. I was reading it, but not on paper. I need to read it again, but I know it's really good.
Hi, Maria. Hello.
Yes, she's like,
Good to see you.
yeah.
Good.
Right? Yeah. No, that's what.
You coming to the restaurant?